Ever notice how your dog insists on sleeping right next to you every night, as if guarding some secret only you can understand? Ethan whispered to himself as he rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the dimly lit bedroom where Luna, his black and white border collie, had already claimed her spot on the edge of the bed. It wasn't unusual for her to curl up next to him, but lately, he had begun to feel an unspoken tension, a question he couldn't quite put into words. As he shifted under the covers, Luna lifted her head, ears perking up, her gaze fixed on him with an intensity that made him pause. Ethan had spent years working long hours, coming home late, and struggling to find a balance between work and personal life, and he had always thought of Luna's sleeping habits as simply a craving for warmth or comfort. Yet tonight, something felt different. Luna's eyes held a silent message, a calm alertness that seemed to scan the room, every sound outside the window, every creak in the house, before settling back on Ethan. He watched as her tail flicked slightly, not in irritation but with a gentle rhythm, almost like a heartbeat syncing with his own, a reassuring signal that she was present and aware. Ethan couldn't help but notice the meticulous way she adjusted her position, her head resting lightly against the edge of his mattress, always maintaining a subtle line of sight between him and the door. There was a precision in her movements, an attentiveness that went far beyond mere companionship. For a moment, he felt a flicker of guilt. He had sometimes pushed her off the bed or ignored her quiet nudges in favor of getting extra sleep or scrolling through his phone. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft breathing of Luna, and Ethan started to sense a rhythm he had never truly appreciated before. It wasn't just about closeness, it was about connection, vigilance, and trust. Every slight twitch of her ears, every shift of her paws, seemed to convey a message. She was there, watching over him, ensuring that he felt safe even when he wasn't fully aware of the reasons why. Ethan's mind began to wander, recalling past nights when Luna had been unusually restless or had positioned herself strategically between him and the door, and for the first time, he considered that perhaps her actions were intentional, a kind of silent communication that transcended his previous assumptions. A quiet smile tugged at his lips as he realized that he had misread her all along, mistaking instinct for affection alone, when in fact there was a deeper layer of awareness at play. As the night stretched on, the shadows of the room danced softly across the walls, and Ethan felt a new appreciation for the intricate, wordless language between him and Luna, understanding that every night she chose to sleep by his side, she was sending a message of protection, loyalty, and an unwavering bond that required no words, only observation and acknowledgement. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting thin lines across the bedroom floor where Luna had shifted slightly, now resting her chin on Ethan's leg, eyes half closed but alert. Ethan rubbed his forehead and stretched, still feeling the lingering calm from the night, and he realized that Luna had a routine of moving just enough to stay connected without disturbing his sleep. As he climbed out of bed, she followed closely, her paws making soft tapping sounds on the hardwood floor, and Ethan could not help but smile at the precision with which she maintained her proximity. In the kitchen, he poured a cup of coffee while Luna settled near his chair, ears swiveling to catch the faintest noises from the neighborhood, her head tilting slightly whenever a sound registered. Ethan remembered how he had once assumed her attentiveness was mere curiosity, but now he saw a pattern. She positioned herself to observe and react to potential disturbances before they reached him. During breakfast, he spoke aloud to himself, recounting the small details he had overlooked for months, the way she nudged objects slightly out of the way to prevent tripping hazards, how she would glance toward the windows and doors after he had finished preparing his meal, and the subtle shifts in her breathing that seemed to align with his own pace. Luna would occasionally rise and pace a few steps, then return to her spot beside him, as if making sure that everything was in order. Ethan sipped his coffee, feeling a mixture of amusement and admiration, realizing that her actions were a combination of instinct and deliberate care, a form of communication that he was only beginning to understand. He recalled past mornings when he had rushed out, barely noticing her presence, and a pang of guilt struck him, knowing that she had been silently ensuring his comfort and safety all along. Luna tilted her head and looked up at him, eyes reflecting a gentle patience, and Ethan found himself speaking to her as though she could comprehend the weight of his thoughts, thanking her for her quiet devotion. The realization settled in that this bond was not one-sided. Luna had been training him in subtle observation, teaching him to be aware of the rhythms and cues that conveyed trust, concern, and connection. Ethan stood, stretching once more, feeling a renewed appreciation for the unspoken dialogue that existed between them, recognizing that each gesture, each careful movement, and each alert glance was her way of sharing awareness and companionship. He knelt down to gently scratch behind her ears, feeling the warmth and softness of her coat, and for a moment, time seemed to pause, allowing him to fully absorb the significance of her presence, understanding that Luna was not merely a pet but a vigilant companion, guiding him to recognize the quiet layers of care and attention woven into the simple act of sharing a morning together. By late morning, the house had settled into a familiar rhythm, and Ethan found himself reflecting on Luna's actions with a new sense of awareness. As he moved from the kitchen to the living room, Luna followed closely, occasionally glancing toward him to gauge his attention before returning to her careful patrol of the space. She paused near the doorway, ears twitching toward distant sounds, and Ethan noticed how she positioned herself between him and any potential source of disturbance, a habit he had once taken for granted. Sitting down on the couch, he poured himself a second cup of coffee and watched as Luna settled beside him, her body forming a protective arc that subtly encompassed him without imposing on his personal space. He marveled at the way she seemed to sense his mood, shifting her head and adjusting her position when he let out a quiet sigh, as if to offer reassurance and companionship without interrupting his thoughts. The sunlight streaming through the windows highlighted the contrast of her black and white coat against the neutral tones of the room, and Ethan realized that her presence created a sense of balance and grounding that he had not recognized before. Luna's movements were precise but gentle, her eyes scanning the room intermittently, and each subtle adjustment communicated attentiveness and care. Ethan reflected on the many mornings he had hurried through his routine, barely noticing the small ways she contributed to the calm and order of his environment, and a sense of gratitude began to replace the lingering guilt he had felt. He considered how her behavior extended beyond instinct, how each small motion and attentive glance served as a form of silent communication designed to foster security and mutual understanding. Luna rose briefly to inspect the perimeter of the room, then returned to her spot beside him, settling with the same deliberate care, and Ethan observed how her breathing gradually synchronized with his own, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the unspoken connection they shared. In that quiet moment, he understood that her loyalty and vigilance were not just responses to his presence but expressions of her perception of the environment, a constant, patient effort to ensure that he felt supported and protected. As he reached down to scratch gently behind her ears, Ethan felt the warmth of her body and the subtle pressure of her head leaning slightly into his hand, a reminder that her companionship was both comforting and intentional. This morning, like so many before, had taught him that Luna's choices, her positioning, and her quiet attentiveness were far more meaningful than he had previously assumed, and he allowed himself to fully embrace the depth of understanding and connection that had grown between them over countless shared days and nights. As the afternoon sun shifted across the living room, Ethan noticed Luna had changed her position once again, moving closer to the window where the light cast a warm glow on her black and white coat. Her ears flicked at every passing sound from the street outside, and Ethan realized that she was not merely following routine, she was actively monitoring her surroundings while maintaining her proximity to him. Sitting back on the couch, he observed her with renewed curiosity, paying attention to the subtle cues he had ignored before, such as the way her tail lightly tapped against the floor to signal contentment or alertness. Luna would occasionally tilt her head toward Ethan, as if seeking confirmation or silently communicating her observations, and he found himself instinctively responding with gentle nods or soft words, acknowledging the silent dialogue they shared. He noticed how she occasionally rose to reposition herself, strategically placing her body between him and potential sources of distraction, yet always maintaining a careful balance that allowed him to feel free and unconfined. Ethan recalled evenings when he had been too absorbed in work or screens to notice these movements, and a wave of appreciation swept over him, understanding that her behavior was deliberate and thoughtful, designed to ensure his comfort and safety without intruding on his personal space. The way she adjusted her stance whenever a new noise registered, and the soft gaze she maintained on him, created an unspoken rhythm that guided him through the quiet hours of the day, blending vigilance with reassurance. Ethan reflected on how much he had underestimated the intelligence and sensitivity inherent in her actions, recognizing that every subtle adjustment, every alert glance, and every gentle nudge was part of a larger system of communication and care that he had only recently begun to perceive. As he poured himself another cup of coffee, Luna shifted slightly, resting her head on his knee in a gesture that was at once protective and comforting, signaling her unwavering presence. The realization deepened that their bond was reinforced not only by affection but also by attentiveness and understanding. Each learning from the other through the subtle exchange of nonverbal cues. Ethan reached down to scratch her behind the ears, feeling the warmth and steadying weight of her body, and he acknowledged silently that Luna's consistent care and vigilance had created a new layer of connection between them, one that was built on trust, awareness, and mutual respect, a quiet partnership that guided them through the hours of sunlight and the shifting dynamics of everyday life. By mid-afternoon, Ethan noticed a gentle shift in Luna's energy, a heightened awareness that he could sense even before his eyes fully registered her movements. She rose from her resting position on the rug and padded softly to the edge of the room, ears angled toward faint sounds from outside, her eyes scanning every corner with meticulous care. Ethan watched her closely, a growing sense of admiration forming as he realized that her behavior was not random but a deliberate sequence of checks and adjustments designed to keep the environment safe and predictable. He recalled moments when he had hurried through his day, oblivious to these subtle signals, and he now felt an emerging responsibility to be equally attentive. As he prepared a light snack, Luna remained nearby, positioning herself so that she could observe both Ethan and the points of entry to the room, her tail swishing slowly as if maintaining an internal rhythm to her surveillance. Each glance she cast toward him seemed to silently ask for acknowledgement, and Ethan found himself nodding or offering soft words in response, deepening the quiet exchange that neither of them needed to speak aloud to maintain. He observed how she occasionally paused to listen intently, then returned to a spot closer to him, maintaining a line of sight that blended protection with companionship. It became clear to him that Luna's actions were not motivated solely by instinctive behavior but by a finely tuned awareness of his habits and the environment around them. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude and humility as he considered the days he had taken for granted the consistency and intelligence in her attentiveness. Her movements were precise yet fluid, never imposing but always aligning with his activities, a testament to the trust and understanding that had developed between them over countless shared routines. As he reached down to gently scratch behind her ears, he noticed the subtle weight of her head pressing into his hand, a gesture that spoke of loyalty, reassurance, and the unspoken bond that guided both of them through ordinary moments. Sitting back, Ethan allowed himself to fully absorb the lesson that Luna had been teaching him in silence, appreciating that every shift, every glance, and every thoughtful positioning was part of a language of care, an ongoing narrative of connection that underscored the importance of observation, patience, and mutual respect within their quiet afternoon together. As the late afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the living room, Ethan felt a deepening sense of connection with Luna, who had moved closer to the sofa, her body curling slightly toward him in a way that seemed deliberate yet unobtrusive. He noticed the subtle shifts in her posture, the way she adjusted her head to maintain eye contact, and the gentle flick of her tail that kept time with his own movements. Every so often, she would rise and pace the room softly, her ears alert to distant sounds, before returning to her spot beside him, her gaze steady and focused. Ethan reflected on how he had often misunderstood these actions, thinking of them as simple restlessness or playful behavior, when in fact they were intricate signals of attentiveness and care. As he leaned back and sipped from his coffee mug, he watched her scan the corners of the room, her eyes catching minor movements and slight changes in light, and he began to recognize the thoughtfulness behind each motion. Luna's awareness seemed to extend beyond mere instinct, it was as if she had an innate understanding of his needs, his moods, and the subtle rhythms of their shared environment. Ethan found himself observing her more closely, noting how she would occasionally nudge an object slightly out of place, almost imperceptibly, or reposition herself to ensure that he could move freely without disturbance. He felt a surge of admiration for the intelligence and sensitivity that underpinned these behaviors, realizing that her loyalty and vigilance were forms of communication he had only recently begun to understand. The sun moved lower, and the room became bathed in a warm, golden hue, highlighting the contrast of her black and white coat against the neutral colors of the furniture, emphasizing her presence as both companion and silent guardian. Ethan thought back to evenings when he had overlooked her quiet gestures, rushing through tasks without acknowledging the subtle ways she had been keeping him connected to the rhythm of their shared home. Now, as he extended his hand to scratch behind her ears, he felt the warmth and weight of her body, a comforting pressure that conveyed trust and reassurance without the need for words. In that moment, he recognized that every glance, every movement, and every gentle adjustment of her position was part of a nuanced dialogue, one that communicated care, vigilance, and a deep-seated bond that transcended simple companionship. Ethan allowed himself to fully absorb the lesson Luna was imparting, understanding that her actions were deliberate, thoughtful, and intended to create an environment of security and awareness, a constant reminder that their relationship was built on mutual observation, respect, and the quiet, unspoken communication that had become an integral part of their daily life together. As the evening approached and the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows, Ethan felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room, a quiet tension replaced by an almost tangible sense of mutual understanding. Luna, sensing the subtle changes in light and energy, adjusted her position to remain within his line of sight, her black and white coat catching the last rays of sunlight and giving her an almost luminous presence. Ethan observed the careful precision of her movements, the way she occasionally lifted her head to listen, then returned it gently to rest on her paws, maintaining an ever-watchful but calm demeanor. He reflected on the countless times he had misinterpreted her actions as mere habit or affection, realizing now that her behavior was deliberate, a nuanced form of communication meant to convey both reassurance and vigilance. Each step she took, each tilt of her head, and every gentle glance was part of a silent dialogue that Ethan was gradually learning to understand, a language of subtle cues and gestures that expressed care, attention, and a desire for his well-being. He watched as Luna shifted slightly to a spot where she could observe both him and the door, her presence creating a protective but non-intrusive boundary that allowed him freedom while maintaining constant awareness of their shared space. Ethan felt a deep sense of gratitude and humility, recognizing that her loyalty and attentiveness were not simple expressions of affection, but deliberate actions meant to ensure that he was aware, comfortable, and secure. The soft rhythm of her breathing, synchronized with his own as he leaned back on the couch, created a calming cadence that seemed to permeate the room, allowing him to pause and reflect on the depth of their connection. Luna's eyes occasionally met his, holding a steady gaze that communicated trust and quiet understanding, and Ethan found himself responding with subtle gestures, nods, and soft words that acknowledged her silent messages. He recalled mornings and evenings when he had overlooked these behaviors, taking for granted the careful balance of companionship and protection she provided, and a wave of insight washed over him, illuminating the richness of their bond. As the last light faded from the room and the shadows grew longer, Ethan extended his hand to gently scratch behind her ears, feeling the warmth, softness, and steady presence of Luna against him, a tangible reminder of the patient, thoughtful, and loyal companion who had quietly shaped his awareness and comfort through countless small, deliberate actions, leaving him with a profound understanding of the subtle, wordless ways in which trust, care, and attentiveness could be communicated between them. As night began to settle over the house and the soft glow of the living room lamp cast warm light across the floor, Ethan felt a deepened sense of connection with Luna, who had nestled closely against his side, her body forming a comforting presence that seemed to anchor the room. He observed the delicate movements she made, adjusting her position with precision so that she remained within his line of sight while still leaving him space to relax and stretch. Her ears twitched at faint noises from the street, and her gaze occasionally shifted toward the windows and doors, a silent indication of her constant awareness of their surroundings. Ethan reflected on how he had previously interpreted her presence as simple companionship, but he now understood that every glance, every subtle adjustment of her body, and every small motion was a deliberate act of attentiveness, a way for her to communicate care, vigilance, and reassurance without words. He noticed how she occasionally lifted her head to check on him, then returned it gently to rest on her paws, maintaining a rhythm that echoed his own calm breathing, reinforcing a sense of harmony between them. As he sipped from his coffee mug, he observed the way Luna's tail moved slowly in quiet agreement with the environment, signaling both relaxation and alertness. Ethan considered the countless times he had overlooked these subtle gestures, now realizing that Luna's behavior had been a constant, quiet lesson in awareness, observation, and mutual respect. Her attentive presence seemed to create a protective atmosphere without being imposing, allowing him to feel both secure and free. The warmth of her body against his side and the gentle pressure of her head resting lightly on his lap conveyed a depth of loyalty and understanding that went beyond simple companionship, illustrating an intricate bond forged through countless shared routines and silent communications. Ethan found himself speaking softly to her, acknowledging the unspoken messages she had sent, and in return, she would lift her eyes to meet his, offering a calm, reassuring gaze that conveyed acceptance, attentiveness, and connection. He realized that the way she positioned herself, monitored the environment, and subtly adjusted to his presence was her way of expressing care and protection, a sophisticated form of communication that relied on observation, trust, and the nuances of nonverbal cues. As the room grew quieter and shadows stretched across the walls, Ethan allowed himself to fully absorb the lesson Luna had imparted through her actions, recognizing that their relationship was strengthened by these quiet moments of attentiveness and awareness, a dynamic of trust and mutual understanding that made every shared evening a reaffirmation of the bond they had cultivated together over time. As the night deepened and the house grew quiet, Ethan sat back on the couch, feeling the comforting weight of Luna nestled against his side. The soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of leaves outside created a tranquil backdrop, yet Luna remained alert, her ears rotating occasionally to catch distant sounds, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the lamp. Ethan reflected on the day and how much he had learned about her subtle ways of communicating, how each movement, each glance, and each gentle nudge had been a deliberate message meant to convey attention, loyalty, and reassurance. Luna lifted her head slightly, resting it momentarily on his knee, her eyes meeting his with a calm and steady gaze that seemed to say she understood him completely without needing words. Ethan reached down to scratch behind her ears, feeling the warmth of her coat and the steady pressure of her head leaning into his hand, and he realized that the bond between them was deeper than he had ever appreciated, a connection built on years of shared routines, trust, and attentive observation. He recalled the mornings and evenings when he had overlooked her careful positioning and silent communication, and he felt a wave of gratitude for the patience and consistency she had shown in guiding him toward greater awareness of his surroundings and of her needs. Each subtle shift in her posture, each careful adjustment in response to noises or changes in light, was a form of dialogue that required observation and mindfulness, a reminder that her actions were purposeful and meaningful. Ethan marveled at the intelligence and sensitivity that allowed her to provide comfort while simultaneously maintaining vigilance, a balance that created a safe and harmonious environment. He noted how her tail swished gently in a rhythm that mirrored the calm of the room, and how her breathing seemed to synchronize with his own, reinforcing a sense of unity and connection. In that quiet moment, Ethan allowed himself to fully appreciate the lessons Luna had imparted through her daily behaviors, understanding that her presence was a constant reminder of patience, loyalty, and the power of silent communication. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that she had been his guide not only in companionship but also in awareness and mindfulness, demonstrating through her actions how observation, trust, and attentiveness could create a profound,